Hello folks, so today I'm going to be doing a little sort of talk on the benefits versus petrol, diesel and electric cars. So let's start with petrol. Petrol emits CO2, which they say is damaging to the world environment, to the ozone layer and all that sort of thing, contributes to climate change. But in my understanding from what we were taught in school, CO2 is what actually helps plants and whatnot to grow. So when you breathe on plants, they grow, don't they? Your house plants. So I'm not entirely sure about that one, but petrol was sort of demonized when they wanted to bring in diesel. So then we talk about diesel now. Diesel emits more local pollutants, such as NOx, which is considered quite bad for human health. So what about electric then? Is electric the saviour? Well, I would argue probably not. The problem with electric is it requires a large amount of resources in order to produce these vehicles. So you need to mine things like lithium and cobalt in vast quantities, often from impoverished third world nations, and at times using slave labour, even sometimes children, so that we feel good about our electric cars and our perceived protection of the environment. So, am I saying electric isn't the answer? Not quite. Electric could be considered the answer, but not for everyone. I would say inside inner cities where you've got tall buildings and whatnot, and you could have pollution that is captured in that environment because it physically doesn't leave naturally because there's not enough greenery and whatnot to absorb it or to get rid of it. Perhaps smaller electric cars can make sense there. But in my opinion, a £90,000 BMW iX or Jaguar I-Pace or a big old Tesla driving around London city centre is no more environmentally friendly than an older petrol. I could understand the argument of diesels not being too good for that environment, although a newer diesel is extremely clean, in all honesty, with AdBlue and catalytic converters and whatnot, and diesel particulate filters. Newer diesel kind of, I think, would be fine driving around a city centre. However, I can understand the argument for only allowing small electric cars in those environments. But allowing people to drive, for example, an Audi e-tron around London city centre free of charge is tantamount to a tax on the poor. You're telling someone that their £90,000 car that has done a ton of damage to the environment in its production process is fine to drive around London city centre because it happens to not have emissions from the tailpipe. What they're ignoring is these cars are very heavy. The batteries are very, very heavy. So your average sort of BMW iX could weigh nearly 3 tons. And that's now driving around using tyres quicker, damaging the road, far more than an equivalent petrol or diesel would. And also wearing things out quicker, like suspension and brakes. So these cars are going to possibly become somewhat of a liability in the future. Now, I would say probably a electric car of that price more than likely will be okay into the future because people will look after it by virtue of its value. I think the real issue is going to come with cars like the small MGs, Kias, Nissans, maybe even Hondas. These cars are significantly cheaper, although still very much a premium over their petrol and electric counterparts. But these cars, when they start to lose their range, because they will, electric cars obviously run on batteries, like your phone or any other battery-powered device. In time, they lose their ability to retain as much charge. When that happens, people are going to scrap these cars. They're not going to replace the battery because the replacement battery on something like a Nissan Leaf is £7,000 to £9,000. Well, on a car that on the used market is probably going for 10,000, 11,000, that's not going to happen. People are just going to get rid of these cars, and then I would question how good is that for the environment. That's awful for the environment. Not only have you used a ton of resources to produce these cars, but you're then going to just scrap them. And then what? What do you do with the batteries? Maybe you recycle them, but these are private businesses. If there's no financial incentive to recycle the batteries, then it's not going to happen. That's just the nature of private business. They need to make money, and in the world of cars, it's getting more and more difficult to make money, hence the homogenization of platforms and technologies, resulting in what I'd argue is fairly boring cars these days. So what is the answer? Well, for me, the answer could be Inner city driving, maybe make it electric only. I mean, for example, in the inner city in London, I wouldn't even consider driving there. I would use the public transport. It's very good. But for everyone else, I would say if you really want to protect the environment and save yourself some money, stop buying a brand new car every 3 years. All you're doing is helping the companies. You're not actually helping the environment in the slightest. How can it be good for the environment to produce these cars en masse and then constantly have people buy new ones every 3 years? How is that any good for the environment? It can't be, can it? It's the same with people talk about mobile phones and they say, oh, is it good to produce a new one every single year? No, it isn't. You shouldn't be buying a new mobile phone every year. The advances and whatnot are not, they don't warrant buying a new phone every year. And it's the same with the cars every 3 years. It doesn't warrant buying a new one every 3 years. It makes more sense environmentally and financially to buy something like an older BMW with a well-renowned engine, like their old straight six engines, or perhaps an older Audi or Jaguar, something that's been well looked after, not an absolute clunker, and keep those cars running. Those are luxury, comfortable, lovely cars. If you look after them, if you service them and treat them with care, you can keep those cars on the road for 20, maybe even 30 years. Surely that makes more sense than putting these cars on the scrap heap and replacing them with new cars, all in the idea of, oh, they're more fuel efficient. Okay, they might well be more fuel efficient, but it's going to take you would have to do 100,000 miles or keep those cars running for 10, 20 years in order to actually see that environmental advantage. And you're not going to see that because these new cars are so complex. What you're going to have is people going into the software and deleting things like the DPF filter or the EGR valves or the AdBlue system. They'll just delete that and they'll run those vehicles without those systems. They're too complicated and too expensive to maintain. Or they'll just get rid of it entirely and that car goes on the scrap. And that is then terrible for the environment and terrible for your wallet as well. So get older cars, look after them, or buy a new car, but aim to keep the thing for 10 years at least. This current regime of changing every few years that we have in the West and in other countries now around the world starting to take on, constantly buying the newest thing just because it's the newest thing. You think it's going to be significantly better, significantly more powerful, significantly more fuel efficient. How does it save you money to buy a new car that gets 5 miles per gallon more when you've just had to shell out another £20,000 of your money to buy it? It doesn't make sense, does it? How does it make sense to buy an electric car for £50,000 and then say, oh, it doesn't cost me very much to charge it, but you could have bought the petrol version for £25,000? Instead, you spent all this extra money and you're just transferring your emissions to the power plant. Now, you could say maybe the power plant is more efficient at producing the electric than what a diesel engine is at producing its power or a petrol engine. There might be some evidence to that, but these power stations run on a need basis. So they generate the electric of what they think people will need and use. So you can't generate enough electric to charge all these cars overnight anyway. It would collapse the grid. If we all replaced our cars with electric right now, we would collapse the grid in the UK at least, and probably in most other countries as well. And never mind the fact that people can't afford it. You're talking £25,000 with the government benefit to buy a Toyota Vauxhall Corsa. That's crazy. I could buy a BMW 3 Series with a 2-litre diesel or even maybe a 3-litre petrol engine that's going to perform much better. It's going to last basically forever if you look after it. I mean, there's cars on the roads that are 50, 60 years old. Now, they've had to be well maintained, but they're still on the roads. Can you honestly tell me an electric car will still be on the roads in that time? I would say no. So I would say in the current state of things, it doesn't make sense, this push for electric cars. And it is a push, and it's not a push with any benefit to the end user in reality. People think, oh, I've got an electric car, isn't it great? What is the difference in your day-to-day driving versus an electric car and an automatic petrol or diesel? I would argue there's no difference. Now, you might quote torque figures or things like that. Oh, it feels great. But maybe a Tesla is safer in a crash because they don't tend to roll because of the high centre of gravity. Low centre of gravity, sorry, because of the high weight of the batteries. But for the average person, are they really going to be sitting there thinking, oh, the torque is slightly better on this electric than it would be in my equivalent petrol? I'm glad I've spent another £16,000 buying this. Oh, and now I have to have £1,000 wall charger put into my house. Oh, and now the gas and electric prices go up, and now it's costing me more to run these cars. It doesn't make sense, at least right now. Now, Elon Musk has said he's going to introduce capacitors into his cars instead of using lithium batteries. Great if that happens, but again, you're talking about huge resources required to produce these things. And unless we transition entirely to solar and wind and nuclear power, and solar and wind really isn't going to even produce enough, we need more nuclear power, because we're charging these vehicles off of oil and gas and coal power stations and lying to ourselves, pretending that they are super fuel efficient when they in fact are not. They'll actually cost you more to run, and they're worse for the environment in many ways. So my takeaway is to buy an older petrol or diesel, not a really old diesel, because they were horrible new and they're horrible now. But if you buy a diesel made in the last 10 years and you look after it and you get it serviced, and you don't just drive it over short distances, a diesel is a perfectly fine vehicle. It's a great vehicle. Don't allow yourself to be conditioned by the politicians to constantly buy the latest thing. Because I'll tell you my prediction now, electric will be replaced by hydrogen fuel. That's my prediction. And suddenly your expensive electric car is going to be vilified the same as diesel was. When they brought diesel in, they vilified petrol. Now they vilify diesel, then they'll vilify electric. That's the way it goes. So get yourself an older diesel, get yourself a really old petrol, maybe 20 years old, right? Pay maybe £1,000 for the car. Maybe it costs you £1,000 a year to look after it, perhaps. Probably not, but maybe it will. It's still going to be significantly cheaper and more environmentally friendly to keep that car on the road running than it will be to keep buying new electric cars. If you live in the inner city and you've got loads of charging opportunities and you want something that you feel like it isn't going to add to the pollution of a closed-in environment like that, maybe get a small electric. But it's not the silver bullet that it's made out to be. So I know this is probably controversial, but if you did enjoy it and if you agree, or even if you disagree with me, chuck me a comment, tell me if I'm wrong. I honestly don't think I am. I've spoken to people who are more in tune with this sort of thing, and they have said pretty much what I'm saying. But feel free, chuck me a comment, leave a like on the video, subscribe, and if you really fancy it, check out my Patreon. And thank you very much for watching.